Next, we will do the fast track revision of the second chapter, which is called Public Finance. We are beginning with the third unit, which is known as Government Intervention to correct the market failure. Right? Now, these are some of the reasons that the market fails. Why does market fail? So, a market fails because of the existence of market power. Then the market fails because of the presence of externalities, both positive as well as negative. Then the market fails in case of merit and demerit goods. Market fails because of lack of information asymmetry or information failure. And finally, the market fails in ensuring equitable distribution of the national income. So first of all, the government intervenes to minimize the market power. Now, we know that whenever there is monopoly, there will be market power. And this market power or monopoly imposes a heavy social cost on the society. When there is monopoly, the producer will produce less than optimum output and he will charge a very high price. Now, governments intervene by establishing rules and regulations designed to promote the competition. So, government has to intervene to ensure that there is healthy competition in the market and no single producer gains monopoly. The government aims at prohibiting the actions that are likely to restrain competition and generate monopoly in the economy. And what can the government do to minimize the market power? The government can formulate and implement laws like the Competition Act. Originally, the Competition Act in India came up in 2002 and later on it was amended in 2007. This Competition Act compels the companies to ensure that there is competition in the market. Any company or any organization which is using anti-competitive activities, such companies will be punished. And then there are natural monopolies such as in case of electricity, gas and water supply. So they are subject to price control. So when there is a case of natural monopoly, it is good for the society to have monopoly in certain areas like in case of electricity, gas, water supply. But there the government controls the prices so that a common man can afford all these goods and services. Next, the government intervenes to correct the negative externalities. Now, one method of ensuring internalization of negative externalities is imposing a pollution tax. Now, since the concept of these taxes was given by Pigou, an economist, they are known as Pigouvian taxes. So, Pigouvian taxes, by making the polluter pay, so the one who pollutes the environment, a tax is imposed on him called the pollution tax, and therefore the one who makes pollution, he has to pay. These taxes seek to internalize the external costs into the price of the product or activity. So those who are producing and consuming such goods which create pollution, they have to pay in the form of this pollution tax. Now, these pollution tax have certain limitations. Pollution taxes are difficult to determine and administer due to difficulty to discover the right level of taxation. Since pollution cannot be measured precisely, it is not possible to measure or calculate the exact amount of pollution tax. Then there are problems associated with inelastic nature of the demand for the good and problem of possible capital flight. Sometimes the demand for the product is inelastic. So even if the tax is imposed on those goods and when the price increases because of that, still the consumption does not decrease. So even after imposing a pollution tax, since the demand was inelastic, the demand and the production continues as it was. And then there is a possibility of capital flight. So if we impose a pollution tax on the companies in our country, the producers will withdraw their investment from our country and the same capital will fly to some other country. So these are the three main limitations of a pollution tax. Actually, the pollution tax should help in internalizing the externalities, the negative externalities, but it will not succeed every time. There are certain limitations. The first limitation is it is difficult to calculate the exact amount of tax which should be imposed. Number two, if the demand is inelastic, then even after imposing the tax, the production and consumption will not fall. And finally, there is a fear that the producers will shift their capital to some other region where such pollution taxes do not exist. Next is the tradable emission permits. So very similar to a pollution tax is the concept of tradable emission permits. Now they are marketable licenses to emit limited quantities of pollutants, and they can be bought and sold by the polluters. The high polluters have to buy more permits, and the low polluters receive extra revenue from selling their surplus permits. So this also is a way, tradable emission permits are also a way to internalize the externality. So those who are polluting, they have to pay for buying these permits. Now there is a diagram which shows the market outcomes of pollution tax. Now this is the marginal private cost curve. This is the marginal social cost curve. Now this is marginal private as well as social benefit curve, right? I repeat, this is the marginal private cost, and then this is the marginal private benefit curve, which is also the social benefit curve. So right now the company is charging this much of price and this much of output is being produced, right? But then this product is such which creates pollution. So this means that besides the private cost, okay, there is some external cost also, and if you add the private cost plus the external cost, you will get the overall social cost. So it is up to here. It is up to here. So what is the amount of external cost? This much. So this is the external cost. So if you add the private cost and the external cost, this is the overall social cost from Q till C, right? And therefore our marginal social cost curve, I am making it green. So this is our marginal social cost curve, right? Now ideally from the society's point of view, this product should have a price of P1 and the output ideally should be only Q1. Now without government intervention, what is happening here? Without the government intervention, more output is being produced and lower price is being charged. So we want this company to charge a higher price P1 because this product creates pollution, and we want this company to produce less because it is not good for the environment. It is a pollution causing product. So this is the situation. I repeat, right now OP price is being charged and OQ quantity is being produced, right? Why? Because the private cost and the private benefit curves are intersecting at this point, right? but then this product creates pollution. So besides private cost, and private cost is the cost of material, labor, etc. Besides the private cost, the product is also having external cost. So what is the amount of external cost? This is the external cost. Okay. And when you add the private and the external cost, you get the overall social cost. So this is the social cost. Now the social cost curve, that means this curve. It intersects the benefit curve at this point. So ideally the price charge should be P1 and the quantity should be Q1. Now government will intervene by imposing a pollution tax. So what the government has done, besides this private cost, this much tax, A1 is the amount of tax which is imposed. So what will happen is that the private cost curve will shift up and it will come here. So this is the new curve post imposition of the tax. So now the producer has to bear the private cost as earlier, plus he will have to bear the pollution tax, and automatically this new curve, let me make it orange in color. So now it is intersecting the benefit curve at this point and the problem is solved. So now they will charge P1 price, the sellers, and they will produce Q1 output. So this is the market outcome of pollution. Next we try to understand how the government intervenes in solving the problem of market failure. Now government intervenes in two ways. One is direct intervention and another is indirect intervention. What are the examples of government's direct intervention? Government acts as a supplier and it supplies public goods and it sometimes supplies or gives correct information to the people. Similarly, sometimes the government buys or procures goods. Okay. Instead of inspiring the people to purchase goods by giving subsidies, government will directly purchase the goods and then distribute it among the people because these goods are good for the society. And then indirectly it can influence the behavior of the private sector by imposing taxes when it wants to discourage the consumption of any particular commodity, and by giving subsidies, okay, where it wants to encourage the consumption. So government can alter the cost for the producers and consumers by imposing taxes or by providing subsidies. And finally, the government can influence the market outcomes through regulations. Government can make certain laws, rules, regulations, and thereby it can influence the behavior of the households and the producers. Now this is the effect of subsidy on output. Now once again, this is our demand curve, the original demand curve. Just give me a minute. This is my marginal, let me call it marginal private benefit curve, which is also marginal social benefit curve, right? Sorry, this is just the marginal private benefit, not social benefit. And then you have the marginal private cost curve, which is also the marginal social cost curve, right? Now we are assuming that this product has a positive externality. That means right now the consumption is this much. This is the equilibrium point. The private benefit and private cost curves, they are intersecting at this point. So this is the original equilibrium. So this much of output is getting consumed or produced. Now since the product is having a positive externality, the external benefits are to be added. So this is the private benefit, we add the external benefit to get the overall social benefit. So this is the overall social benefit. So your social benefit curve, right, the green one, okay, is this, right, and this curve intersects the cost curve here. So ideally the consumption should have been Q1. So this is desirable from the society's point of view, whereas this is the actual quantity, right? Now what can be done to ensure that the consumption of this product, which is having a positive externality, increases from Q to Q1? For ensuring that, the government will have to give a subsidy worth, yeah, to the extent of this much. So this is the amount of subsidy which should be given, and that will push the demand curve, okay, to the right, because the subsidy is available, people will consume more. And then, so subsidy basically pushes the demand curve from here to here, and then it ensures that the socially desirable amount is getting consumed. So this is the effect of subsidy on output. Without subsidy, the output will be Q, and with subsidy the output will be Q1, right? And subsidies are to be given when the goods are having positive externalities. Next is the concept of merit goods. Now merit goods such as education, healthcare, etc., they are socially desirable and they have substantial positive externalities. They are rival, excludable, limited in supply, rejectable by those unwilling to pay, and they involve positive marginal cost for supplying to the extra users. So basically merit goods, okay, they are socially desirable and they have substantial positive externalities. Other than that, they have all the characteristics of a private good. Just like a private good, the merit good has the characteristic of rivalry, okay. Similarly, if someone is not paying the price, they can be excluded from the consumption. They are limited in supply. Those who are unwilling to pay, they can reject the consumption of education, health and other merit goods. And in order to provide merit goods to additional people, the company has to incur positive marginal cost. Okay, so this is the meaning of merit goods. So what you should remember, if they ask you to define merit goods, just mention that these are socially desirable goods. The benefits of these goods are more compared to what the consumers pursue. So consumer will perceive the benefit to be this much, but actually the benefit is much larger compared to what he perceives, and they have substantial positive externalities. Left to the market, merit goods are likely to be underproduced and underconsumed. Now this is because of the characteristic of merit good. I told you just before a moment that people feel that the benefit is this much. This is the utility they will get. This is what the people feel. But actually they are getting much more utility. So this is what they actually get, and this is what they feel they will get. And because of this fact, these goods are underconsumed and underproduced. Since people feel that the benefit is only this much, okay, actually the benefit is this much, but they feel that it is only this much. That is the reason that they consume these goods less compared to what they should. And therefore, the social welfare will not be maximized. And that is the reason that government has to intervene to increase the consumption or production of merit goods. The possible government responses to under provision of merit goods are regulation. Government can make a rule that consuming a certain minimum amount is compulsory. It's a regulation, it's a rule. Okay. For example, compulsory education. Similarly, laws can be formulated. Government can also give subsidies to encourage people to consume more. Okay. and then government can directly provide these goods to the people. If they are not willing to spend money, the government can purchase it and then freely give it to the people because it is very good for them. When the governments provide merit goods, it may give rise to large economies of scale and productive efficiency, and there will be substantial demand for the same, right? So if they are given free of cost, when the government provides, then there will be a substantial demand for these goods. So people might not want to spend from their pockets, but if these goods are given free of cost, there might be a huge demand. Now these are the market outcomes of merit goods. That there are different ways and diagrams to explain the same thing. We are following the diagrams which are given in the ACCA module. So let me explain this diagram to you. So this is our original demand curve or marginal private benefit curve, and since there is no external benefit, so private benefit itself is the social benefit, okay, and then this is the private cost curve. So this is my original equilibrium point A, and at that point the price is P and the quantity is Q. So this is what is being actually produced and charged, right? But since it is a merit good, okay, we may either say that the benefit is more. You can either take the private benefit curve to the right. So that is what I generally do, but this is how it is shown in the ACCA module. So they are saying that the actual cost is less compared to what is perceived by the consumer. So actually people feel that this is the cost, but actually the cost is only this much, right? And therefore the social cost curve comes down. So this is the equilibrium ideal for the society. So the price of these merit goods should be lesser, right? And the quantity should be more. And this triangle is the loss of social welfare. So welfare loss because of the underproduction or under provision, this triangle, this is the shaded part, and that is the loss of welfare, okay. So this is how you explain. I repeat very quickly. This is the equilibrium point, okay, because this is the point where the private cost and private benefit curves are intersecting each other. But since it is a merit good, the social cost is much lesser compared to the private cost. So social cost is lesser, and therefore this is the equilibrium which is best for the society, and the output should have been Q1 instead of Q and the price should have been lesser, right? Next we try to understand the consumption of merit goods at zero price. Now suppose this is the supply curve and this is the demand curve. So this is the point of equilibrium. Right now this much price is being charged, let us call it P, and this is the quantity which is being produced or being consumed. Now see, this is the socially desirable consumption, okay, from here till here the entire population should be consuming this good. But since the price is this much, only half of the population is consuming the merit good, the remaining half is not. So if you want everybody to consume, okay, if you want the demand to be OD1, what is happening at OP1 price? This is P1. At this price, only half of the population is consuming the merit good. And ideally what should happen? Entire population should consume it. Everybody should consume. So the only way to do that is to give the merit good free of cost, make the price 0, give it free, let the price be 0. So when price is 0, your x-axis becomes your supply curve. So this is this red one, the x-axis is your supply curve, and this is the demand curve, and now the demand and supply curve are intersecting here. So price is 0 and this is the quantity which is consumed. So in order to ensure that everybody consumes the merit goods, it is important that you provide these goods totally free of cost. Next we talk about the demerit goods. Now demerit goods are goods which impose significant negative externalities on society as a whole, and they are believed to be socially undesirable. So there are two important characteristics of demerit goods. They are socially undesirable and they have negative externalities. Now here the private individuals feel that the cost is much less as compared to what it actually is. So actually these goods are costly. Okay. For example, smoking a cigarette. Now people feel that the cost is 5 rupees, but then it will also damage your health, and the damage cost to the health is also a cost which is not being considered. So actually the cost is very high, it is much more, but people feel that the cost is less. Such goods are known as the demerit goods. Now how does the government intervene in case of demerit goods? Now the production and consumption of demerit goods are likely to be more than optimal. Why people will consume demerit goods more than optimal? Because they feel that the cost is less, actually the cost is more, and that's the reason they consume it more. So under free markets where there is no government intervention, there will be overconsumption and overproduction of demerit goods. So the government should therefore intervene in the marketplace to discourage the production. Okay, government should try to discourage their production and consumption, right? Now this is a diagrammatic presentation of the outcomes of minimum price for demerit goods. Now this is the private cost curve, which eventually is also the social cost curve, and this is the private benefit curve. So the private cost and private benefit curves, they are intersecting at point B. So what is being charged? What is the price? This is the price which is being charged by market, and this is the quantity which is being produced or consumed. Now these are the goods where the costs are more compared to what they are believed, and in other words these are the goods where the benefits are less compared to what they are believed. So people feel that I will get this much of benefit, right, but actually the benefit is much lesser. So this is what the individuals perceive, that this is the benefit I will get. So this is the private benefit, right? But then from the society's point of view, the benefit is only this much, and therefore the private benefit curve, right, it shifts to the left. So your curve comes here and this becomes your new curve, right? This is your new curve. I would have taken the cost curve to the left. That means I would have increased the social cost, okay, because here the cost is more compared to what it is perceived, or you can interpret it as the benefit less than what it is perceived. So this is the equilibrium suitable for the society. So here what should be done? You should produce only this much, right? So instead of consuming or producing this much, the consumption should be this much, okay, and the price is less, right? But since low prices are not desirable, because what they will do is they will increase the consumption instead of reducing. So in order to do that, what we do is we go for minimum price for demerit goods. So this is our target. Actually the market will consume or produce this much, okay, but we don't want this, we want this, okay. but then if you see the price is much lower, which is not compatible for less consumption. We want the price to be high, and therefore a minimum price has to be decided. So government will decide this minimum price, and this minimum price P1, it intersects the private benefit curve here. So at such a high price, the consumers will consume only Q1. So one way to reduce the consumption of demerit goods and bring them to the optimal level is to charge a certain minimum price, in this case P1. Next, we try to understand how will the government intervene in case of public goods. Now, in case of pure public goods where entry fees cannot be charged, direct provision by the governments through the use of general government tax revenues is the only option. Excludable public goods can be provided by the government, and the same can be financed through entry fees. So in case of pure public goods, there is a problem of free riding and nobody can be excluded from consumption. So the only way to provide public goods is direct provision. Government will have to produce or procure them and will have to provide them free of cost to the people. And then the government has the power to impose the taxes on people, and through those tax revenues, these goods can be financed. Next is price intervention. Now, price controls may take the form of price floor, okay, minimum price the buyers are required to pay, or the price intervention can take the form of price ceiling, the maximum price which the sellers are allowed to charge for a good or service, right? Now, when price of certain essential commodities rise excessively, the government may resort to control these prices through price ceilings. They are also called maximum prices, for making the resource or the commodity available to all at the reasonable price, right? So the price interventions basically, when the price intervention is in the form of price ceiling, the objective is to protect the buyers, okay. A maximum price is fixed and a price higher than this maximum price cannot be charged. With the objective of ensuring stability in the prices and distribution, the governments often intervene in the grain market through building and maintaining of the buffer stock. So what happens is that when a price ceiling is fixed and the ceiling price is lower compared to the market price, the demand for the product can be very high because actual market price is higher, but the government has decided a ceiling price below the market price. So at that lower ceiling price, what will happen? The demand will exceed the supply, and the government will have to maintain the buffer stock from where it will have to supply the product to meet that additional demand, which is because of the price ceiling. And how will the government intervene to correct the information failure? The government makes it mandatory to have accurate labeling and content disclosures by the producers. For example, the Stock Exchange Board of India, it requires that accurate information should be provided to the prospective buyers of the new stocks. Similarly, the government goes for public dissemination of information to improve the knowledge and subsidizing of initiatives in that direction. Okay, so government will give information to the people like in the form of consumer awareness programs, right? Then next is equitable distribution. One of the most important activities of the government is to redistribute income so that there is equity and fairness in the society. And what all can the government do? Which policies the government can adopt to ensure equitable distribution? Some common policy interventions include progressive income tax, targeted budgetary allocations, unemployment compensation, transfer payments like subsidies, social security schemes, job reservations for socially and economically backward people, land reforms to bring equality in rural areas, gender sensitive budgeting, where more budget is allocated for the development of women, right? So these are some of the policies which can be implemented to ensure equitable distribution of the national income. Then there are some questions. Okay, describe direct government action to solve the problem of negative externality. So government initiatives towards negative externalities may be classified as the market-based approaches, like environmental taxes, that is pollution tax, and cap and trade system, that is the pollution permits, right? They operate through price mechanism to create an incentive for change. And then you have the direct controls, about which the question is. So direct controls that openly regulate the actions of those involved in generating the negative externalities. Production, use and sale of many commodities and services are prohibited in the country. These direct controls prohibit specific activities that explicitly create negative externalities. So government can simply ban the goods which are not good for the people. So that is a direct control to control the negative externality. Next is, what do governments provide, rather why do governments provide public goods? So as we have seen earlier, that in case of public goods, it is not possible to exclude anyone. So public goods are non-excludable and they are highly prone to the free rider problem, and therefore the markets are unlikely to get established, and that is the reason that government should provide the public goods, because private sector will never provide them. Direct provision of the public good by the government can help overcome free rider problem, which leads to market failure. In the case of such pure public goods where entry fees cannot be charged, direct provision by the governments through the use of general government tax revenue is the only option. Define a demerit good and point out its characteristics, something we have already done, right? So demerit goods are goods which are believed to be socially undesirable. Examples of demerit goods are cigarettes, alcohol, intoxicating drugs, etc. And the production and consumption of demerit goods are likely to be more than optimal under free markets. The demerit goods are characterized as those goods which impose significant negative externalities on the society, and therefore the private costs incurred by the individual consumers are less compared to the social costs experienced by the overall society. The next question is, what are the consequences if demerit goods are left to the free market? Now, the demand for demerit goods such as cigarettes and alcohol is often highly inelastic, so that any increase in the price resulting from additional taxation causes less than proportionate decrease in the demand, and also sellers can always shift the taxes to the consumers without losing the customers. So basically the question is, what will be the consequence if demerit goods are left to free market? If they are left to free market, in one word or in one line, the answer would be they will be over consumed. And even after imposing taxes, their consumption may not decrease as much as expected or as much as desirable or required. The effect of stringent regulation such as total ban is seldom realized in the form of complete elimination of the demerit good. Conversely, such goods are secretly driven underground and traded in a hidden market. And even if government bans the consumption of certain goods like alcohol, there is always an underground market where these goods are traded in a hidden manner. The next is, explain why governments impose taxes on goods and services. Now, governments correct market failure resulting from demerit goods by imposing unusually high taxes on producing or purchasing the goods, making them very costly and unaffordable to many. This is perhaps the most commonly used method for reducing the consumption of the demerit goods, right? So why the government imposes taxes on goods and services? in order to reduce the consumption and production. And this will happen in case of those goods which create negative externalities or the goods which are demerit goods. Explain why government provides subsidies. Illustrate a few examples of subsidies. Now, subsidies are given to encourage the consumption or production of certain goods. So subsidies involve government paying a part of the cost to the firms in order to promote the production of goods having positive externalities. This is in fact a market-based policy, as subsidies to consumers will lower the price, shift the demand curve to the right and increase its consumption. Explain why the governments impose price ceiling. So when the prices of certain essential commodities rise excessively, the government may resort to controls in the form of price ceiling, also called maximum price, for making these resources or commodities available to all the people at a reasonable price. For example, maximum prices of food grains and essential items are set by the government during times of scarcity. A price ceiling which is set below the prevailing market clearing price will generate excess demand over supply. And as mentioned in one of the previous answers, that whenever that happens, government has to release the product from its buffer stock so that the supply can match the new excess demand. How do you justify food price controls and the rent controls? Now, housing and food are necessities, and so the food prices and the housing rents should be reasonable. So to keep the rents and food prices under control and making them available to all, government fixes the price ceilings on them. So it is totally justified, since they are necessities, they are essential. Price controls and food price controls and rent controls are totally justified. Next is explain why governments impose price floors. Now, the objective is to guarantee steady and assured income to poor producers like farmers. In case the market price falls below the minimum support price, then the guaranteed minimum support price will prevail. Nevertheless, mere announcement of higher support prices for the commodities which are not effectively backed up by the government procurement arrangements, they will not serve the purpose. So government will have to do two things. Number one, the government will have to declare a minimum support price, and then if the people are not buying the product from the farmers at that minimum support price, government should be ready to procure that product at the market at the minimum support price. Next is, why do governments fix minimum wages? Now, wages are earned by poor workers. The countries where the supply of labor is very high, the wages on offer can be very low, not enough to sustain a decent life. So under such circumstances, the government has to fix minimum wages to ensure reasonable wages and reasonable standard of living for the poor workers, right? So these were some of the important aspects of the third unit of the second chapter, which is known as government intervention in case of market failure. Next, we will do fast track revision of the fourth unit of the second chapter. The name of this fourth unit is fiscal policy. Now, this is a brief overview of the topic. So first, we need to understand the objectives of the fiscal policy, followed by the two different types of fiscal policies, that is automatic stabilizer and discretionary fiscal policy, the instruments of fiscal policy, and finally the types of fiscal policy. And here the two types are automatic stabilizers and the discretionary fiscal policy. And here the two types are expansionary fiscal policy and contractionary fiscal policy. Now, this is the definition of fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the government's policy to influence the aggregate demand by influencing the taxes, expenditure and debt. So whenever the government changes or makes a change in taxes, expenditure and debt in order to influence the aggregate demand, it is known as fiscal policy. So what is the fiscal policy? It is the government's policy and it is aimed at influencing the aggregate demand. And how? By making changes in taxes, government expenditure and government debt. Now, in the long run, the main objective of the fiscal policy is to achieve economic growth. Okay, so in short term, it may try to bring equality and stability, but in the long run, the main objective of fiscal policy is to promote the economic growth. A well-designed tax policy that rewards innovation and entrepreneurship without discouraging the incentives will promote the private businesses who wish to invest and thereby help the economy grow. So, what kind of fiscal policy will result into economic growth? Okay, that can be a question. So, the answer is that when the fiscal policy is having a well-designed tax policy which rewards innovation and entrepreneurship without discouraging the incentives will promote the private businesses. So basically the rate of tax should be low. That will encourage and incentivize the private sector, and then the private sector will invest more money, which will result into economic growth. Similarly, how does fiscal policy help in reducing the inequalities of income and wealth? So in that, the fiscal policy should have a progressive direct tax system where the rate of tax increases with the level of income, so that rich have to pay a higher rate of tax whereas the poor have to pay either no tax or very low tax. Then the indirect taxes should be differential, which means that the basic necessities should be exempted from taxes whereas luxury goods should be heavily taxed. So that is differential indirect tax system. And a carefully planned policy of expenditure. So government's expenditure policy should be such that maximum expenditure is for the welfare of the poor people. So a progressive direct tax system, a differential indirect tax system, and expenditure policy which focuses on the welfare of the poor will result into more equality in the economy. It will reduce the inequalities of income and wealth. Now, what are the main objectives of fiscal policy? Now, the main objectives of fiscal policy are: number one, achievement and maintenance of full employment, maintenance of price stability, acceleration of the rate of economic development, and finally, equitable distribution of income and wealth. So, this slide in the last point combines two objectives. One is acceleration of the economic growth rate, and the other one in the same point, the third point, is equitable distribution of income and wealth. So in any country, the fiscal policy aims at achieving and maintaining full employment, then it aims at maintaining price stability, then it aims at accelerating, that is increasing the rate of economic development and growth, and finally the fiscal policy aims at equitable distribution of income and wealth. Then we talk about the two types of fiscal policies. One is automatic stabilizers, where the government does not declare anything new in the fiscal policy. The built-in mechanism works in order to bring stability. And then there is discretionary fiscal policy, in which the government comes out with new declarations. So automatic stabilization occurs through automatic adjustments in government expenditure and taxes without any deliberate government action. So these automatic adjustments work towards stimulating the aggregate spending during the recessionary phase and reducing the aggregate spending during the economic expansion. So whenever there is a recessionary phase, automatically the fiscal policy becomes expansionary. Okay, that means the aggregate spending of the government gets stimulated, and whenever and whenever there is a recession, or rather expansion in the economy, there is a boom, then the fiscal policy automatically becomes contractionary and the aggregate spending gets reduced. However, these automatic stabilizers that depend on the level of economic activity alone would not be sufficient to correct the instabilities, and therefore the government needs to resort to discretionary fiscal policy. So the inbuilt mechanism or the automatic stabilizers, although they help in bringing stability, but they are not enough alone, and therefore along with the automatic stabilizers, discretionary fiscal policy is also required. Next, discretionary fiscal policy for stabilization refers to deliberate policy actions on behalf of the government, on the part of the government, to change the level of expenditure and taxes to influence the level of national output, employment and prices. Now you have three main instruments of fiscal policy. The first is government expenditure. Now this generates income through multiplier effect. So whatever expenditure the government makes, it will influence the economic activity, but not to the extent of the expenditure. Okay, it will influence the economic activity many more times as compared to the original expenditure, and that is due to the working of the multiplier effect. The second instrument of fiscal policy is tax. Now taxes determine the size of disposable income of the public. So when the tax rate increases, the disposable income of the public goes down, and when the taxes decrease, then the disposable income of the people will increase. So by influencing the disposable income of the people, the taxes influence the economic activity. And finally you have the budget, a widely used tool to stimulate or contract the aggregate demand. So whenever the government wants expansion in the economy, it will go for a deficit budget, and whenever the government wants contraction in the economic activity, it will go for a surplus budget. Now these are the two main types of fiscal policies. This is the most important part of this unit from the exam point of view. So one, you have the expansionary fiscal policy, and then you have the contractionary fiscal policy. So first let us talk about the expansionary fiscal policy. Now an expansionary fiscal policy is used to address recession in the economy and the problem of unemployment on account of business cycle. So whenever there is a recession, and because of that recession there is the problem of unemployment, that is when the government adopts the expansionary fiscal policy. Now this is the working of the expansionary fiscal policy. Now this is the aggregate demand curve, the downward sloping curve, and this is the aggregate supply curve. These are the original curves. Now these two curves are intersecting each other, okay, at this point. So this is the equilibrium point. Now at this point of equilibrium, this is the equilibrium national income Y1, and the equilibrium price is P1. So this is from where we begin. However, the problem is that although this Y1 is the equilibrium national income or equilibrium output, it is not the full employment equilibrium. Okay, it is not full employment national income. Full employment national income is Y2. So that means there is some unemployment in the economy. And what is the extent of unemployment in the economy? Y1, Y2 is the extent of unemployment. Now, classical economists argue that because of this unemployment, the wages will fall, and when the wages will fall, the producers will recruit more workers, and when they will recruit more workers, the supply will increase, and so the aggregate supply curve will shift from AS1 to AS2. And now this new supply curve intersects the original demand curve at this point. The problem gets solved. We achieve full employment equilibrium. But then during the Great Recession of 1929, this did not happen. So the market is not capable of achieving full employment equilibrium on its own, and that is mainly because of the downward rigidity of the wages, and therefore economists like Keynes suggest that since the aggregate supply curve does not shift from left to right, okay, the government should adopt expansionary fiscal policy so that the aggregate demand curve is pushed to the right. So you will get the new aggregate demand curve, okay, and this curve will intersect the original supply curve here. So of course there will be a bit of inflation, but it will get full employment for you. So this is how the expansionary fiscal policy works. Now when the government finds that there is unemployment in the economy, it will increase the public expenditure, it will reduce the taxes, and this kind of expansionary fiscal policy will eventually push the aggregate demand curve to the right so that we achieve full employment. Next you have contractionary fiscal policy. Now contractionary fiscal policy is adopted for eliminating the inflationary gap. So here the government basically reduces its expenditure, so there is a decrease in the government spending, and number two, there is increase in the personal income tax or the business taxes. And sometimes there is a combination of two. On one hand the government reduces the government spending, and on the other hand it increases the taxes. A combination of decrease in the government spending and increase in the personal and the corporate income tax. Now this is the working of the contractionary fiscal policy. So this is the original aggregate supply curve, this is the original aggregate demand curve, okay, and the two are intersecting at this point. So this is the original equilibrium price and this is the original equilibrium national income. Now this is not just equilibrium national income, it is also full employment national income. Now suddenly, because of some reason, the aggregate demand in the economy rises. Now when the aggregate demand increases, the producers try to increase the production so as to match this increased aggregate demand. So they try to increase the supply so that they can take the advantage of this increased demand. But the problem is that there is already full employment in the economy. All the factors of production and resources are already fully employed. So what happens is that when the producers increase the demand for factors, okay, the supply does not increase. Actually the prices of the factors will increase, and because of increase in the prices of the factors, what will happen is that the supply will fall. So aggregate supply curve will shift from here to here, right? So what happens first? We are at this point of equilibrium. Now because of some external shock, the aggregate demand curve shifts from AD1 to AD2, right? And there is an inflationary gap. Because of this, we come from this point to this point. So now the price has increased from P1 to P3, right? And why this happens? Because when the aggregate demand increases, we cannot increase the aggregate supply because there is already full employment. So what happens is now this aggregate supply shifts from right to left, right? I repeat the argument. I am explaining the reason why did this curve go to the left, the supply curve. And when the demand increases, the producers try to increase the aggregate supply. They want to increase it. But instead of increasing, the aggregate supply actually falls. And why does it fall? Because when the demand increases, producers try to match the supply. They create extra demand for factors, but since all the factors are already fully employed, and increase in the demand for factors only results into increase in the prices of factors and not the supply. And when the factors become expensive, the profit margin decreases, due to which the aggregate supply falls. So we come here at P3. Now, in order to eliminate this inflationary gap, the government will have to adopt a contractionary fiscal policy. Government will reduce the spending, so government spending will come down. Government will increase the taxes. So these are the two main components of a contractionary fiscal policy. And now what will happen? Because of these two actions by the government, now the aggregate demand curve will again start coming to the original level, right? And when it comes back to the original level, the final equilibrium point is this, because now the latest aggregate supply curve is this one, The dotted one is the latest aggregate supply curve, and the new demand curve post the contractionary fiscal policy. It intersects the supply curve here. So prices can be brought down, okay, to some extent, not to the original level P1, but they can be brought down slightly from P3 to P2 using contractionary fiscal policy. Then we have some important questions. We already seen the definition of fiscal policy. So fiscal policy involves the use of government spending, taxation, borrowing to influence both the pattern of economic activity and the level of growth of aggregate demand, output and employment. These are the main objectives of fiscal policy. We have just seen them. So the most common objectives of fiscal policy are achievement and maintenance of full employment, maintenance of price stability, acceleration of the rate of economic development, and finally equitable distribution of income and wealth. And the importance as well as the order of priority of these objectives may vary from country to country and from time to time. Next is distinguish between discretionary and non-discretionary fiscal policy. Discretionary fiscal policy for stabilization refers to deliberate policy actions on the part of the government to change the levels of expenditure, taxes to influence the level of national output, employment and prices. So whenever the government wants to bring changes, in national output, employment and prices, deliberately it will bring changes in the taxes and the expenditure. So that is known as discretionary fiscal policy. In case of non-discretionary fiscal policy or automatic stabilizers, okay, the structure of the economy, they are part of the structure of the economy, and these measures are built in, okay. So they are built-in fiscal mechanism. It operates automatically to reduce the expansion and contraction of the business cycle. All this becomes clear in the next answer. So explain how automatic stabilization brings in the stability in the economy. Now in automatic or non-discretionary fiscal policy, the tax policy and expenditure pattern are so framed, and taxes and the government expenditure automatically change with the change in the national income. See, it involves built-in tax or expenditure mechanism that automatically increases the aggregate demand when there is recession. So what does the automatic mechanism do? It increases the aggregate demand when there is recession, and it reduces the aggregate demand when there is inflation in the economy. Now personal income taxes, corporate income tax and transfer payments like unemployment compensation, they are the prominent automatic stabilizers. Now how do built-in stabilizers combat the demand pull inflation pressures? The built-in stabilizers automatically remove the spending from the economy to reduce the demand pull inflationary pressures and further the expansionary stimulation. Automatic stabilizers work through limiting increase in disposable income during an expansionary phase and limiting decrease in disposable income during the contractionary phase. Next, what are the symptoms of the beginning of recession? Yeah, at the beginning, demand for goods and services in the selected sectors start declining, reducing the demand for materials and inputs. So see, this is what happens, okay, in the beginning phase. So what are the symptoms of the beginning of recession? So if this is happening, it is to be understood that the recession is somewhere around. So what happens is that demand for goods and services, not in all the sectors, but in selected sectors, start declining, okay, reducing the demand for particular materials and inputs. Now during recession, the incomes are reduced. With progressive tax structure, there will be decline in the proportion of income that is taxed. This would result in lower tax payments as well as some tax refunds. Simultaneously, the government expenditures will increase due to increased transfer payment like unemployment benefit. So This is how the automatic stabilizer works when there is a recession in the economy. So when there is recession, what will happen? Since the incomes are reduced during recession, okay, under the progressive tax structure, what will happen? There will be decline in the proportion of income that is taxed. Okay, and this will result in lower tax payment, as well as some people will get the tax refund. And similarly, since there is more unemployment during recession, the government expenditure will increase in the form of unemployment allowances, due to which the economy will gradually start coming out of the recession. These two together, these two means reduced payment of taxes and increased government expenditure, mainly in the form of unemployment allowance. These two together will provide proportionately more disposable income available for consumption spending to the households. And in the absence of such automatic responses, household spending would tend to decrease more sharply, and the economy would in all probability fall into a deeper recession. So this last part, okay, these two paragraphs, they don't have anything to do with the symptoms of early symptoms of recession, right? So they are basically showing how the automatic stabilizers work when there is recession in the economy. Next is explain the term recessionary gap. Now a recessionary gap, also known as contractionary gap, it's said to exist if the existing level of the aggregate production is less than what would be produced with full employment of resources. This gap occurs during the contractionary phase of the business cycle, and it results in higher rates of unemployment. So recessionary gap is a very simple concept. Recessionary gap is also known as contractionary gap, and when the existing levels of aggregate production is less compared to what would be produced through full employment of resources. So you can say that when the equilibrium national income is lower compared to full employment national income, we would say that there is a recessionary gap. In other words, recessionary gap occurs when the aggregate demand is not sufficient to create conditions of full employment. The next is what should be the tax policy during recession and depression. Now it's common sense that if there is a recession in the economy, okay, the government should aim at reducing the taxes. So during recession and depression, the tax policy is framed to encourage the private consumption and investment. As I mentioned earlier, a general reduction in income taxes will leave higher disposable incomes, with people inducing higher consumption. Similarly, low corporate taxes will increase the prospects of profits for the businesses, and therefore it will promote further investment. The extent of tax reduction and increase in the government spending required depends on the size of the recessionary gap and the magnitude of the multiplier, assuming that the recessionary gap is very small, right? And suppose the value of the multiplier is very high, so then a slight decrease in tax and slight increase in expenditure will be sufficient. But if the recessionary gap is not small, suppose it is very large, the recessionary gap, and the value of K is very small, that means if the investment multiplier is very small, so then a huge reduction in the tax will be required, a huge increase in the expenditure will be required, right? What are the consequences of excessive taxation on the businesses? Now, naturally, excessive taxes on the businesses will discourage the investment. The businesses will be discouraged. With lesser net profits, the businesses will make lesser investment. Next is distinguish between pump priming and compensatory spending. Both of them are types of government spending. A distinction is made between two concepts of public spending during depression, namely the concept of pump priming and the concept of compensatory spending. Now, pump priming assumes that when private spending becomes deficient, certain volumes of public spending will help to revive the economy. Okay, only certain volume. Whereas compensatory spending is said to be resorted to when the government spending is carried out with the obvious intention to compensate for the entire deficiency in private investment. So whenever pump priming expenditure is done by the government, it is smaller in magnitude, whereas compensatory spending is very large. The next is describe the term expansionary fiscal policy. So we already seen that expansionary fiscal policy is designed to stimulate the economy during the contractionary phase of the business cycle, or when there is anticipation of a business cycle contraction. This is accomplished by increasing aggregate expenditures and aggregate demand through an increase in all types of government spending. Next is what is meant by crowding out. Now, crowding out effect is the negative effect of fiscal policy, okay, which is generated when money from the private sector is crowded out to the public sector. In other words, when spending by the government in the economy replaces the private spending, the latter is said to be crowded out. This is an example of crowding out effect. If the government provides free computers to the students, then the demand from the students for computers may not be forthcoming. When government increases its spending by borrowing from the loanable funds from the market, then the demand for the loans increases, and this pushes the interest rate up. And when the interest rate is high, the private sector will be able to borrow less. So since the government has borrowed money from the banking sector, okay, so it seems that the investment has increased because government will invest these funds. But because of heavy borrowings by the government from the banking, the interest rate will increase. And when the interest rate increases, the private investment goes down. So this is known as crowding out effect, right? Crowding out of the private expenditure. Explain the use of fiscal policy for economic growth. Now, expansionary fiscal policy with low tax rates and high public expenditure will be required for the economic growth. Next is what types of fiscal policy measures are useful for the redistribution of income in the economy. So if the objective of the fiscal policy is to achieve economic equality, then what kind of fiscal policy will be required? A progressive income tax policy with high taxes on the rich and poor being exempted from taxes, and most of the government's expenditure should be for the welfare of the poor. So this kind of fiscal policy measures are useful for redistribution of income in the economy. Next, what are the measures undertaken in contractionary fiscal policy? We have already seen that under contractionary fiscal policy, okay, number one, there is decrease in the government spending. So with decrease in the government spending, the total amount of money available in the economy is reduced, which in turn will trim down the aggregate demand. And secondly, there will be increase in the taxes, both personal income tax and corporate tax. And increase in the personal income taxes will reduce the disposable income, leading to a fall in the consumption spending and aggregate demand. And increase in the tax on business profits reduces the surplus available to the business, and as a result, the firm's investments will shrink, causing aggregate demand to fall. Increased taxes also dampen the prospects or profits of potential entrants who will respond by holding back their fresh investments. Next is point out the limitations of fiscal policy. Now, the main limitations of fiscal policy are as follows. Fiscal policy changes may at times be badly timed due to various lags, so that it is highly possible that an expansionary fiscal policy is initiated when the economy is already on the path of the recovery and vice versa. And secondly, it is practically difficult to reduce government spending on various items such as defense and social security, as well as on huge capital projects which are already midway. So these are the two main limitations. One, there are lags. And number two, it is very difficult to reduce the government expenditure when already they have been committed. Hello friends, welcome to this quick revision session in Economics for Finance for CA Intermediate students. Now we begin with the first unit of chapter number 4, which is known as the theories of international trade. Now in the exam they will give you this kind of table and they will ask you which country has got absolute cost advantage in which product. The question is, which country has an absolute cost advantage in which product? Now if you compare countries A and B with respect to good X, you can see that country A can produce more of good X as compared to country B, whereas country B can produce only 1 unit of good X in 1 hour. Country A can produce 6 units. So this means that country A has got an absolute cost advantage in production of good X. Once again compare country A and B. Okay, you can compare these two countries with respect to second product, that is good Y, and you can see that as compared to only 4 units produced by country A, country B can produce 5 units of good Y. So this means that country B has got an absolute cost advantage in the production of good Y. So A can produce more of good X as compared to country B, and country B can produce more of good Y as compared to country A. So A has got advantage in good X and B has got advantage in good Y. Now the same question has been twisted a bit. Now instead of giving the information in terms of output, now the information is given in terms of labor hours, and again the question remains the same: which country has absolute advantage in which product? Now compare these two countries A and B with respect to good X. Now see, country B takes 3 hours to produce 1 unit of good X, whereas country A produces the same product in same amount in much less time, just 1 hour. So this means that since country A can produce good X in lesser time as compared to country B, A has got an absolute advantage in the production of good X. Once again we compare the two countries A and B with respect to, good Y. Now see, country A can produce 1 unit of good Y in 2.5 hours, whereas country B can produce 1 unit of good Y in only 2 hours. So that means country B is taking less time to produce good Y as compared to country A. This means that country B has got an absolute advantage in the production of good Y. Next, you are getting a question on comparative cost advantage theory. Here the question is very similar: which country has got comparative cost advantage in which product? Now you can see that country A is absolutely superior in the production of both the goods, X as well as Y, as compared to 1 unit of good X produced by country B. Country A is able to produce 6 units. So in production of X, country A is superior. Similarly, as compared to 2 units of good Y produced by country B, A is able to produce double, that is 4 units of good Y. So country A is absolutely superior in production of both the goods, but you can see that country A is comparatively more superior, 6 times superior in the production of good X, whereas only twice superior in production of good Y. So you can say that A has got a comparative advantage in the production of good X. Now please focus on country B. Now B is inferior in production of both the goods. As compared to 6 units of good X produced by country A, country B can produce only 1 unit. Similarly, as compared to 4 units of good Y produced by country A, country B can produce only 2 units. So country B is inferior in production of both the goods, but it is comparatively less inferior, okay, in the production of good Y. It is only 2 times inferior in production of Y, whereas in good X it is 6 times inferior. So B has got a comparative cost advantage in the production of good Y. You can either say that country B has lesser disadvantage in Y, or you can say comparatively compared to X, in Y it has got an advantage. Next, you need to know the crux of the HO theory. And what is the crux? The country in which there is abundance of labor, abundance, plenty of labor, that country should specialize and export the labor intensive product. Naturally, because of the abundance of labor in this country, the labor would be cheap, and therefore the cost of producing a labor intensive product will be relatively lesser. So such a country which is having abundance of labor, it should specialize and export the labor intensive product. On the other hand, the country in which there is abundance of capital, such a country should specialize and export the capital intensive products, because in this country, due to the abundance of capital, the capital will be relatively cheaper, and the factor endowments decide the comparative cost advantage. So this is the main contention of the HO theory. So HO theory tells us that it is the difference in the factor endowments in different countries which is responsible for the comparative cost advantage. Next, we have the opportunity cost advantage theory. Now, in this question, they will ask you to find out the opportunity cost of producing both the products in both the countries. So, what is the opportunity cost of producing good X in country A? Now see, in order to produce 6 units of good X, country A has to sacrifice 4 units of Y. So for producing 6 units of X, the country has to sacrifice 4 units of Y. This itself means that for producing 1 unit of good X, country A will have to sacrifice 0.66 units of good Y. So 6:4 is equal to 1:0.66. And in country B, if the country wants to produce 1 unit of good X, it will have to sacrifice 2 units of good Y. So what is the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of good X in country A? It is 0.66 units of good Y. And what is the opportunity cost of producing good X in country B? It is 2 units of Y. So you can see that the opportunity cost of producing good X is lesser in country A. It is only 0.66 Y. So this means that country A has got the opportunity cost advantage in the production of good X. Country A should specialize in good X and it should export it, right? Whereas in country B, the opportunity cost of producing 1X is much higher as compared to 0.66Y, it is 2Y. So country B should not attempt the production of good X. Instead of trying to produce good X on its own, country B should import good X from country A. Now let us try to find out the opportunity cost of good Y in both the countries. In order to produce 4 units of good Y, country A has to sacrifice 6 units of good X. This itself means that for producing 1 unit of good Y, country A will have to sacrifice 1.5 units of good X. Now, if we take country B, for producing 2 units of Y, country B has to sacrifice 1 unit of X. This itself means that for producing 1 unit of Y, it will have to sacrifice 0.5 units of good X. So what is the opportunity cost of good Y in country A? It is 1.5x. In order to produce 1 Y, country A will have to sacrifice 1.5 units of good X. And what is the opportunity cost of good Y in country B? It is 0.5 units of X. Now we can see that the opportunity cost of producing good Y is lesser in country B. Okay. A has to sacrifice 1.5x, whereas country B has to sacrifice only 0.5x. So this means that B should specialize in the production of Y and export it to the other country. Now the second unit of this chapter is known as the instruments of trade policy, and the topic is divided into three parts: tariffs, non-tariffs, and the export related measures. So we begin with the definition of trade policy. Trade policy encompasses all instruments that governments may use to promote or restrict imports and exports. So that is the definition of trade policy. What are the objectives of trade policy? Now the purpose of the instruments of trade policy is to promote or restrict imports or exports. So basically trade policy aims at influencing the imports and exports of the country. How do you define tariff? Tariff is also known as custom duty, and it is defined as a financial charge in the form of a tax which is imposed at the border on goods going from one custom territory to another territory. What are the objectives or goals of tariff? The main goals of tariff are to raise revenue for the government, and more importantly, the goal of the tariff is to protect the domestic import competing industries from foreign competition. Then the next is different forms of import tariffs. The first is specific tariff. A specific tariff is an import duty that assigns a fixed monetary tax per physical unit of good which is imported. Next is ad valorem tariff. An ad valorem tariff is levied as a constant percentage of the monetary value of 1 unit of the imported good. Then you have mixed tariff. Mixed tariff is a category of tariff in which the authorities impose either an ad valorem or a specific tariff, whichever is higher. Next you have the compound tariff. This tariff is calculated on the basis of both ad valorem duty as well as a specific duty. So it's a combination of the two, ad valorem and specific, whereas the previous one is either or. It is either ad valorem or the specific duty, whichever is higher. Next is most favored nation tariff. Now this is the uniform tariff rate which is charged by one WTO member country on imports from all other WTO members. Then you have the anti-dumping duties. Now dumping occurs when the manufacturers sell goods in a foreign country below the sales price in their domestic market or below their full average cost of product. It hurts the domestic producers of the importing country. Now anti-dumping measures are additional import duties so as to offset the foreign firm's unfair price advantage. Then you have the countervailing duties. The countervailing duties are tariffs to offset the artificially low prices charged by exporters who enjoy export subsidies and tax concessions which are offered by the governments in their home country. Then you have the bound tariff. A bound tariff is the maximum tariff which a country can impose on a particular product. It is product specific rate, and this rate is decided by the WTO and is applicable for the WTO members only. Next you have the escalated tariff structure. It refers to the system wherein the nominal tariff rates on imports of manufactured goods are higher as compared to the nominal tariff rates on the intermediate inputs and raw materials. That is, the tariff on the product increases as that product moves through the value addition chain. Then you have the tariff rate quota. An import quota is a direct restriction which specifies that only a certain physical amount of the good will be allowed into the country during a given time period, usually the period of 1 year. The tariff which is imposed on amount exceeding this limit is called the tariff rate quota. Next is preferential tariff. Now this preferential tariff is a lower agreed tariff which is charged by members of the RTA within the group. Okay, this is generally on the reciprocal basis. So when the countries formulate a regional trade agreement, they provide a lower concessional tariff rate to each other. This rate is known as preferential tariff. Next you have prohibitive tariff. It is an exorbitant tariff with the motive of preventing the international trade. So when the rate of tariff is very high, it sometimes exceeds 100%, 200%. So such a tariff is known as a prohibitive tariff. Next you have the effects of tariff. Okay, now tariffs, number one, they create obstacles in the way of international trade, and thereby they reduce the prospect of market access. Tariffs will make the imported goods more expensive in relation to the domestic goods, and therefore there will be increase in the consumption of domestic goods and reduction in the consumption of the foreign goods. Then the tariffs will help in protecting the domestic industry, and they will also generate revenue for the government. Next we have non-tariff measures. Now non-tariff measures are policy measures other than the ordinary custom tariffs that can potentially have an economic effect on international trade. Now these are the two main categories of non-tariff measures: technical measures and non-technical measures. We begin with technical measures. In that we have two. So first is sanitary and phytosanitary measures. Now these measures are applied to protect the human, animal or plant life from risks which are arising from addiction, pastes, contaminants, toxins or disease causing organisms. Next you have technical barriers to trade. Now these barriers, they restrict trade when the product does not satisfy the specified technical details regarding quality standards, size, shape, design, labeling, marketing, etc. Next we have import quotas. Now import quota is a restriction on physical amount of imported goods during a period of time. Next we have the price control measures. Now price control measures are additional domestic taxes, sometimes also known as para-tariff, and this may also take the form of minimum price of the imported goods. Next is non-automatic licensing and prohibition. Under non-automatic licenses, the mandatory import licenses are used to obstruct the trade. Every foreign seller, or rather every domestic importer has to take an import license, without which he cannot import the goods. Then you have the financial measures. Financial measures regulate access to the and cost of foreign exchange, and these measures try to make the foreign exchange inaccessible. Then you have measures affecting competition. Now under this we grant exclusive or special preferences to one or a few limited group of economic operations. This will also restrict the free international trade. Then we have government procurement policies. Now government may lay down policies with respect to procurements, where the government can have a policy to purchase only domestically produced goods and not the imported ones. Next you have trade related investment measures. Now these measures target overseas investment and they may include rules on local content requirements on production and the TBR. The next is restriction on post-sales services. There are restrictions on providing post-sale services to discourage the sales. Next is distribution restriction. The terms for distribution are deliberately made stringent to discourage the sales. Then you have administrative procedures. By making administrative procedures lengthy and cumbersome, involving red tape and corruption, this is a way to discourage trade. Then you have rules of origin, not allowing the products wherein the source of product is not determined. And finally, you have embargo, which means there is total ban on import or export of some commodity. Besides, you can have safeguard measures. They are temporary measures which prohibit the sale of particular product whose domestic demand had suddenly dropped. Finally, you have the export related measures. In that, the first is ban of export. Exports of certain items may be banned during shortage period. Then you have export taxes. An export tax is a tax which is collected on the exported goods. That also is meant to discourage the exports. Then you have the export subsidy. It includes financial contributions to domestic producers in some form of income or price support, and export subsidies and incentives are given by the government to promote or boost the exports. And finally, you have the voluntary export restraints. Voluntary export restraints refer to a type of informal quota administered by an exporting country, voluntarily restraining the quantity of goods that can be exported during a specific period of time. This is to appease the exporter and avoid retaliatory measures by importing country. The third unit is on trade negotiations, and there are three parts: the regional trade agreements, general agreement on tariff and trade, and finally the World Trade Organization. So let us start with the meaning of regional trade agreements. RTA regional trade agreements are defined as groupings of countries not necessarily belonging to the same region, and they are formed with the objective to reduce the barriers to international trade between the member countries. Now, these are some major types of RTAs. The first is unilateral trade agreement, where one country gives lot of tariff discounts and reduces the trade barrier for the other countries unilaterally. Generally, this happens when the rich country wants to encourage the exports of the poor countries. Unilaterally, they declare a lot of incentives for these countries. So they will reduce the tariff and non-tariff barriers unilaterally. Then you have bilateral agreements. Here, two countries bilaterally reduce trade barriers for each other. Then you have regional preferential trade agreements. Here there is a group of countries which reduces trade barriers for each other's product. Then you have trading bloc, in which there is total free trade. The countries remove all types of trade barriers, both tariff as well as non-tariff barriers on each other, and they generally charge a common tariff from the non-members on a particular commodity. Next, you have free trade area. Now, this is a type of RTA where the group members or the countries in the group, they remove all kind of tariffs on each other's product, but they retain their independence of imposing tariff on the non-members. In case of custom unions, once again the countries will remove tariffs on each other's product, but then they retain the independence of imposing the tariff. They don't charge, rather they charge a common tariff in case of custom union. In free trade area, there is no tariff on each other's product, and they retain the independence of imposing tariff on the non-members. In case of custom union, again there is no tariff on each other's product, but they impose same or common tariff. Earlier I said they retain the independence, but actually they don't retain any independence. They impose a common tariff on the non-members for a particular product. Then you have common market. Now common market is very similar to trading bloc, where the countries adopt total free trade, neither tariff barriers nor non-tariff barriers. But besides goods and services, there is free movement of factors of production, and there are common corporate and financial laws in the member countries. And finally, you have economic and monetary union. Now this is a group of countries where there is common currency, and they have a common or same or similar macroeconomic policies. Their monetary and fiscal policies are very similar to each other. The more important ones are FTA. Now free trade area is a group of countries that eliminate all tariffs on trade with each other, but they retain the independence in determining their tariff with other members. And a good example of FTA is NAFTA, North American Free Trade Area. Next, you have monetary union. In an economic and monetary union, members share a common currency and macroeconomic policies. For example, the European Union countries, they implement and adopt a single currency, and they have common macroeconomic policies. Next, we have the functions of WTO. Now WTO does its functions by acting as a forum for trade negotiation among the member governments. Then WTO administers the trade agreements. It reviews the national trade policies. It cooperates with the other international organizations like World Bank, IMF, and finally it assists the developing countries in trade policy issues through technical assistance and training programs. What is the main objective of WTO? Now, the main objective of WTO is to facilitate the free flow of international trade, smoothly, freely, fairly, and predictably. So basically, the objective of WTO is to encourage international trade. Next, we have the major guiding principles of the WTO. The first is trade without discrimination. That means most favored nation treatment should be given to all the members of the WTO. There should not be any discrimination in case of international trade. All the countries should be treated equally. The next is the national treatment principle. The way a country treats its national goods and companies, it should treat the foreign goods and foreign companies in the same manner. The next is freer trade. The trade should become more free as compared to what it was under GATT. So along with tariff, non-tariff barriers should be addressed. Along with goods, the trade of services should be encouraged. The trade of agricultural goods should be encouraged. There should be international movement of capital as well. Next is there should be more predictability in international trade. That means countries should not unilaterally change the rate of tariffs without notice. So sudden changes should not be allowed. The next is general prohibition of quantitative restrictions. So import quotas and other quantitative restrictions should be totally eliminated. Next, you have the agreement on textile and clothing. Earlier there was an agreement called MFA, which allowed the developed countries to set quantitative restrictions on imports of textiles and clothing, but then this particular agreement was eliminated and a new agreement, ATC, agreement on textile and clothing, was put in place. And according to this new agreement, all the countries will have to make free trade in textile and clothing. Quotas cannot be imposed. So this is what should be done. That is what the recommendation is. Next is there should be greater competitiveness. That means anti-competitive activities like dumping, giving subsidies, tax concessions to the domestic producers, that should not happen. And then tariff can be used as a legitimate measure for protecting the domestic industry. If some country wants to protect the domestic industry, it can do so, but not through non-tariff measures. Tariff should be the legitimate measure for protecting the domestic industry. Then there should be transparency in decision making. Whenever a country introduces change in the trade policy, this should immediately be informed to the other countries. Progressive liberalization. Trade liberalization cannot happen overnight. So gradually the trade should be liberalized by the members of the WTO. And finally, each country should ensure that there is market access for the foreign products. You should not snatch away the accessibility of your market from the foreign products or the imported goods. These are some of the limitations of the WTO. Number one, it is very difficult to build the consensus due to diverse interests. While multilateral efforts have efficiently reduced tariffs on industrial goods, the achievement in liberalizing trade in agriculture, services, textiles, and apparel, and in many other areas of international commerce has been negligible. So although there has been success in increasing the trade of industrial goods, the trade of agricultural goods, services, textiles, apparels has been very limited. Then protectionism and lack of willingness among the developed countries to provide market access on a multilateral basis has driven many developing countries to seek the regional alternatives. So the developed countries are highly protectionist and they do not allow the imports from the developing countries. There is a north-south divide. The countries from the northern hemisphere, generally the developed countries, they and the countries from the southern hemisphere, which are generally the lower and middle income countries, so their interests do not match, and therefore there is a divide. There is a constant conflict between these two parts. The next is another major issue concerns tariff escalation, where an importing country protects its processing or manufacturing industry by setting lower duties on imports of raw materials and components and higher duties on the finished products. Number 7, the developing countries have raised a number of issues in Doha agenda in respect of the difficulties that they face in implementing the present agreement, and the least developed countries have outrightly rejected to follow the agreement. So these are some of the limitations of the WTO. Next we have an overview of the WTO agreements. The first is the agreement on agriculture. Now, according to this agreement, all the members of the WTO will encourage the trade of agricultural products. The next two are agreement on SPS measures and the technical barriers to trade. Now, according to these two agreements, all the members of the WTO will avoid the misuse of SPS measures and TBT to restrict the trade and to discriminate the trade. So health standards and technical standards, they should not become an obstacle in the way of free international trade. They should not be misused. The next is the trade related investment measures or TRIMs. According to this agreement, all the members of the WTO will allow the other countries or other members to do foreign direct investment. There should not be any condition for investing in the country. So conditions like domestic content requirement or trade balancing requirement, all such conditions cannot be imposed on the foreign investors. The next is agreement on anti-dumping duty. Now, according to this agreement, no country will misuse the anti-dumping measures to restrict the trade. The next is custom valuation. This is not validation, this is custom valuation. Now, according to this agreement, all the countries will follow a consistent method for valuating the customs. There should not be any arbitrariness. There should be consistency in the method of valuing the customs. Next is the agreement on pre-shipment inspection. According to this agreement, the exporter will allow the PSI agency of the importer to inspect the product which it is going to export. Next we have the rules of origin. Now, according to this agreement, the foreign companies will have to give evidence of their origin. They originate from which country, they will have to prove that. The next is the agreement on import licensing procedures. So there is an agreement that all the members of the WTO will try to simplify the procedures for procuring the import licenses. Next is the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. According to this agreement, the terms subsidies are defined. What should be considered as subsidy and what should not be considered as subsidy, and under what circumstances the countervailing duties can be imposed, and under what circumstances the countervailing duties cannot be imposed. That has been discussed in this agreement. Next is the agreement on safeguards. This means that every member country can safeguard the interest of its domestic industry, but it should not, the safeguard measures should not be misused to restrict the international trade. Next is trade in services. According to this agreement, every member country will encourage the international trade in services just as it is done in case of goods, right? And there should be national treatment and MFN treatment in case of the trade in services. Next is the agreement on intellectual property rights. Every member country should protect the intellectual property rights of the imported goods, and while protecting the intellectual property rights, there should be national treatment and the MFN treatment with all the companies. Next we have agreement on settlement of disputes. So according to this agreement, the disputes will be settled in an objective manner in a given time frame. There will not be any subjectivity or bias in the decision making. Next is the trade policy review mechanism. According to this agreement, every member country will allow the WTO to review its trade policy. Next we have plurilateral trade agreements on trade in civil aircraft and government procurement. According to this agreement, as far as civil aircrafts are concerned, there should be total free trade, and as far as the agreement on government procurements is concerned, there is an agreement that when the governments are procuring goods and services from the private sector, there should not be any discrimination in favor of the domestic goods. Now this is a quick revision of the first unit of the third chapter. Chapter 3 is called Money Market, and the name of this unit is the concept of money demand, okay, the important theories. Now in this unit there are two main topics which we have to study. The first is the functions of money. Now you know that there are 4 functions of money. We will study them, and then you have the theories of demand for money. And in the syllabus there are 5 important theories of demand for money: the cash transactions approach, the cash balance approach, Keynes's liquidity preference approach, then the Baumol and Tobin approach, and finally we have the Friedman's approach. Let us start with the functions of money. Now you all know that there are 4 main functions of money. The first function is medium of exchange. So money serves as a medium of exchange. It helps us in buying and selling goods and services. Then it serves as a unit of account or a measure of value. The third is it is a standard of deferred payments. If you want to make the payments in future, money is a good standard to do that. And finally, money serves as a store of value. So money performs 4 important functions. Since money is easy to store, it is durable, it serves as a store of value. You can save value in terms of money. Next we have the meaning of demand for money. Now what do you mean by demand for money? Now demand for money basically is that part of the individual's wealth which he wants to keep in the form of cash with himself. So that is known as demand for money. The first theory is cash transactions approach, also known as Fisher's equation of exchange. Now why people demand money or cash? Now according to this approach, people demand money or cash for the transaction purpose. They want to buy day-to-day goods and services, and that's the reason that they demand money according to this theory. Then on which factors does the demand for money depend upon? Now according to this approach, the demand for money purely depends on the income, the nominal income of the individual. And there is a direct relation: more the nominal income an individual has, greater will be his demand for money, and vice versa. And which is the equation used in this approach and the equation is MV is equal to PT, and this equation shows the money market equilibrium. The next is the cash balance approach, sometimes also known as the Cambridge approach. Now, according to this approach, people demand money or cash not just for the transactions purpose, but they also demand money for precautionary purpose. Now, which are the factors on which the demand for money depend upon? Now, according to this approach, the demand for money by an individual not only depends on his nominal income, it also depends on the government's policy, especially the tax policy, and the individual's personality. Okay, so how much risk he wants to take by putting his money in risky ventures, so that also will decide the demand for money. Next, you have equation which is used for the explanation, and here the equation is this: M is equal to a fraction of the nominal income. So this is showing the money market equilibrium. So this is the equation which is used in the cash balance approach, okay, or the Cambridge equation. Next, you have the liquidity preference approach. Why people demand money or cash? Now, according to Keynes, who has given this approach, people demand money for three purposes: transaction purpose, precautionary purpose, and the new is speculative purpose. Which are the factors on which the demand for money depends on? Now, according to this approach, the demand for money not only depends on the income, it also depends on the interest rate. So according to Keynes, the transactions demand for money and precautionary demand for money, they mainly depend on the income, and there is a direct relation between income and this kind of demand for money, or these kinds of demand for money. And as far as the speculative demand for money is concerned, it depends on the interest rate. And there is an inverse relation between the interest rate and the speculative demand for money. And what is the equation which is used for this approach? So the total demand for money is a function of income. Okay, rather the transactions demand for money is a function of income. The precautionary demand for money is also a function of income, whereas speculative demand for money is a function of interest rate. Next, you have the Baumol-Tobin approach. Now, according to this approach, people demand money basically for the transactions purpose, and there are three factors on which the individual's demand for money depends upon. The first is income, with which it has a direct relation. Second is the interest rate, with which the demand for money has an inverse relation. And the third one, the new one which this approach adds, is the transaction cost, and there is a direct relation. If the transaction cost of putting your money in the form of a deposit is very high, okay, you would like to keep more in cash. So there is a direct relation between the transactions cost and the demand for money. And finally, you have Friedman's approach. So why people demand money? So that has not been specified in this approach, and the factors which determine the demand for money are overall wealth of an individual and not just income. So there is a direct relation between the demand for money and individual's income and wealth. Then you have the interest rate, with which the demand for money has an inverse relation. Price level also affects the demand for money. Higher the price, more the money you will need with yourself for transactions. So there is a direct relation between price level and the demand for money. And as far as inflation is concerned, there is an inverse relation. Now, if the prices are continuously increasing, it is better to convert your money into different goods and services, because in future these goods will become expensive. So these are the factors which influence the demand for money. Next, we have the second unit of the third chapter, and the name of the unit is the concept of money supply. Right? Now, first we begin with the measurement of money supply. Now, there are four measures of money supply in India. The first is M1, and it includes the currency notes and coins with the people. then the demand deposits of the banks, that is the current and saving deposits accounts, and finally the other deposits with the RBI. The second measure of money supply in India is M2, and M2 is equal to M1 plus saving deposits with the post office saving banks. M3 includes M1 plus the net time deposits with the banking system, and finally M4 is equal to M3 plus total deposits with the post office saving organization, excluding the national saving certificate. Then, following the recommendations of the working group on money, in 1998 the RBI has started publishing a set of 4 new monetary aggregates, on the basis of the balance sheet of the banking sector in conformity with the norms of progressive liquidity. The new monetary aggregates are, the first is the reserve money, which includes the currency in circulation plus the bankers' deposit with the RBI, and finally the other deposits with the RBI. Then you have new money 1, NM1, currency with the public plus the demand deposits with the banking system plus the other deposits with the RBI. NM2 includes NM1 and the short-term time deposits of the residents, including and up to contractual maturity of 1 year. And finally, you have NM3, which includes NM2 and the long-term time deposits of the residents plus the call term funding from the financial institutions. Now, the central bank has also measures macroeconomic liquidity. The central bank also measures the macroeconomic liquidity by formulating various liquidity aggregates in addition to the monetary aggregates, while the instruments issued by the banking system are included in money instruments. Those which are close substitutes of money but are issued by the non-banking financial institutions are also included in the liquidity aggregates. So L1, that is liquidity 1, includes NM3 plus all deposits with the post office saving banks, excluding the NSC. L2 will include L1 plus the term deposits with the term lending institutions and refinancing institutions, and term borrowing by financial institutions plus the certificate of deposits issued by the financial institutions. And finally, L3 includes L2 plus the public deposits of the non-banking financial companies. Next is the concept of money multiplier. The money multiplier, the money supply is defined as M is equal to small m into MB, and where this M is the money supply, the small m, it shows the money multiplier, and MB is the monetary base or the high powered money. Now, from the above equation we can derive the money multiplier as M is equal to, small m is equal to money supply upon monetary base. Now, the money multiplier M is defined as the ratio that relates the changes in the money supply to a given change in the monetary base. It is denoted by M, and it denotes by how much the money supply will change for a given change in high powered money. The multiplier indicates that what multiple of monetary base is transformed into the money supply. Next, you have the money multiplier approach to the supply of money. The money multiplier approach to money supply, propounded by Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz in 1963, it considers the following factors as immediate determinants of money supply. So, money supply depends on the stock of high powered money, that is H. It depends on the reserve requirements. It depends on the ratio of reserves to deposits. It depends on the ratio of currency to deposits, and finally it depends on the interest rate. So these are the main determinants of money supply according to the money multiplier approach. Now, the three main factors affecting money supply are the behavior of the central bank, the behavior of the commercial banks, and finally the behavior of the public. Right? Now, how does the behavior of the central bank influence the overall money supply? So the central bank determines the high powered money, The central bank decides the interest rate and central bank decides the CRR. So by deciding these three, the central bank can influence the overall money supply in the economy. Then how does the behavior of the commercial banks influence the overall money supply? Now the commercial banks decide how much of excess reserves they should have, right? And similarly the commercial banks create credit also. So through their credit creation process and by maintaining excess reserves, the commercial banks influence the money supply in the economy. And finally, it is the behavior of the public which influences the overall money supply. The people's desire to hold cash, that is currency ratio to the deposits, that is what decides the money supply. If people decide to hold a lot of cash with themselves, there will be less deposits, and with lesser deposits the credit creation will be smaller, due to which the money supply will be less. So to summarize, we can say that the money multiplier approach tells us that the size of the money multiplier is determined by the required reserve ratio, that is R, okay, by the central bank, the excess reserve ratio which is decided by the commercial banks, and the currency ratio which is mainly decided by the public. So the lower these ratios are, the larger is the money multiplier. So there is an inverse relation between these three ratios and the money multiplier, and therefore these three have an inverse relation with the money supply also. What is the effect of government expenditure on the money supply? So whenever the central and state governments' cash balances fall short of the minimum requirement, they are eligible to avail of a facility called ways and means advances, which is an overdraft facility. And when the Reserve Bank of India lends to the government under the ways and means advances or overdraft system, it results in generation of excess reserves, and the excess reserves thus created can potentially lead to an increase in the money supply through the money multiplier process. Then we have certain short answers. Explain the nature of currency issue under minimum reserve system. Now under the minimum reserve system, the central bank is empowered to issue currency to any extent by keeping only a certain minimum reserve of gold and foreign security. Next is define credit money. Now credit money refers to the fraction of money supply created by the commercial banks in the process of borrowing and lending transactions with the public. List the components of M1. Now M1 is composed of currency and coins with the people, the demand deposits of the banks, which includes both current and saving accounts, and the other deposits with the RBI. The next is distinguish between M1 and M2. So M2 includes M1 as well as the saving deposits with post office saving banks. So M2 is a broader concept as compared to M1. Next we have what is the rationale behind inclusion of net demand deposits of the banks in the money supply measurement. Now money is deemed as something held by the public. Since interbank deposits are not held by the public, they are netted out of the total demand deposits to arrive at the net demand deposits. Define reserve money. Reserve money is composed of currency in circulation, the bankers' deposits with the RBI, and the other deposits with the central bank or RBI. Write a note on two major components of reserve money. Now reserve money has two major components. The first is currency in circulation and second are reserves. Currency in circulation comprises of the currency and cash with the public and banks, whereas reserves are bank deposits with the central bank. Describe the term CRR. Now banks in a country are required to maintain deposits with the central bank to meet the central bank prescribed reserve requirements or cash reserve ratio, as also to meet the settlement of obligations. So these balances, they represent the balances which are maintained by the banks in the current account with the Reserve Bank of India. What do you mean by money multiplier? The money supply is defined as capital M, that is money supply, equal to M times the monetary base, where M is the money supply, the small m is money multiplier, and MB stands for monetary base or the high powered money. Money multiplier M is defined as a ratio that relates the change in the money supply to a given change in the monetary base. Next is, what is the nature of relationship between the money multiplier and the overall money supply? The multiplier indicates that multiple of monetary base is transformed into money supply. The link from reserve money to money supply is through the money multiplier. The multiplier process operates as long as banks have excess reserves. There is a direct relationship between the money multiplier and the money supply. Next is, what would be the effect of money multiplier if the banks hold excess reserves? Now, the additional units of high powered money that go into excess reserves of the commercial banks, they do not lead to any additional loans, and therefore these excess reserves do not lead to creation of deposits. In other words, excess reserves may be considered as an idle component of reserves, and therefore they have no effect on the money multiplier. Next is, what effect does government expenditure have on money supply? Now, when the Reserve Bank lends to the government under the ways and means advances or overdraft, it results in the generation of excess reserves, that is excess balances of commercial banks with the Reserve Bank. The excess reserves thus created can potentially lead to an increase in the money supply through the money multiplier process. Then you have, what is the value of money multiplier in a system of 100% reserve banking? Now, if the banks keep the whole deposits as reserves, there will be no new money which will be created by the banks. Define the credit multiplier and how is it calculated? Now, the credit multiplier, also referred to as the deposit multiplier or deposit expansion multiplier, it describes the amount of additional money created by commercial bank through the process of lending and available money it has in excess of the central bank's reserve requirements. It is the reciprocal of the required reserve ratio. If reserve ratio is 20%, then credit multiplier is 1 upon 0.20, which is equal to 5. So credit multiplier basically is given by the formula 1 upon the CRR. Then there are some application oriented questions. Compute the reserve money from the following data published by the RBI. So if you want to calculate the reserve money, you will basically add the three: currency in circulation, the bankers deposit with RBI, and other deposits with the RBI. So when you add these three given numbers, this is what you get. The next is compute M3 from the following data published by the RBI. So what is given here is the currency with the public, the demand deposits, the time deposits, and other deposits with the RBI. Now, if this would have been M1, we would not have included the time deposits, but since this is M3, we will add all the four. So the answer we get is this. So this is the broad money or M3. Next is, what will be the total credit created by the commercial banking system for an initial deposit of rupees 1000 for required reserve ratio of 0.02, 0.05 and 0.10% respectively. So this is the formula for credit multiplier. Credit multiplier is 1 upon CRR. So if 1000 is the initial deposit, you multiply it by 1 upon 0.02, you get 50,000. So 50,000 is the overall credit multiplier. So that much is this is the credit multiplier, and this is the overall credit which will be created on the basis of this much of initial deposit. Similarly, for the other rates, that is 0.05 and 0.10, this is the total money supply which you will get. So this is the credit multiplier, this is the original deposit, you multiply the two, okay, then you get the overall credit created by the commercial bank. Next is, how would each of the following affect the money multiplier and money supply? Now the first is, commercial banks in India decide to hold more excess reserves. Now excess reserves are those reserves that the commercial banks hold with themselves in addition to the mandatory reserve requirements. Excess reserves result in an increase in the reserve deposit ratio of the banks. This reduces the money for lending, and so the money multiplier will be low. As a result, money supply declines. Next is, fearing shortage of money in ATMs, people decide to hold money. So when people hold more money, it increases the currency deposit ratio, reduces the money multiplier, and money supply declines. Next we have, the banks open large numbers of ATMs all over the country. So what will be the impact on money multiplier and money supply? ATMs let people to withdraw cash from the bank as and when needed. This reduces the cost of conversion of the deposits to cash and makes deposits relatively more convenient. People hold less cash and more deposits, thus reducing the currency deposit ratio, increasing the money multiplier, causing the money supply to increase. Now banking becomes very common and nearly all people use them. So what will be the impact on money multiplier and money supply? This again will reduce the currency deposit ratio. As people are keeping more deposits, banks get chance to create more money through credit creation, and so the value of money multiplier will be high. Consequently, the money supply will be high. During the festival season, people decide to use ATMs very often. Now if people for any reason are expected to withdraw money from ATMs with more frequency, then banks will want to keep more reserves, and this will raise the reserves and lower the money multiplier. As a result, the money supply will decline. Number 6, if banks decide to keep 100% reserves, what would be the effect on the money multiplier and money supply? Now if banks decide to keep 100% reserves, then the credit multiplier 1 upon CRR is 1 upon 1 is equal to 1. So no additional money supply will be created as there is no credit creation. So whatever is the initial deposit, okay, it remains the same. Credit is not created on the basis of initial deposit. Suppose the banks need to keep no reserves, only 0% reserves are there. Now if the required reserve ratio is 0%, then money multiplier is infinite and there will be unlimited money creation. There will be a chaos with spiraling prices as money supply is too much and the real output cannot increase. Next is the third unit of the third chapter on money markets. The name of this unit is monetary policy. The first is the meaning of monetary policy. Now monetary policy refers to the central bank's policy to regulate the availability, cost and use of money. In other words, the monetary policy is essentially a program of action undertaken by monetary authorities, that is the central bank, to control and regulate the demand for and supply of money with the public and the flow of credit with a view to achieve predetermined macroeconomic goals. Now monetary policy encompasses all the actions of the central bank which are aimed at directly controlling the money supply and indirectly at regulating the demand for money. These are the main objectives of monetary policy. The first important objective of monetary policy is to promote economic growth. Then you have the objective to obtain price stability. Then we have ensuring full employment. Monetary policy is also used to achieve the balance of payments equilibrium, and finally stability in the foreign exchange rate. Now these are the four monetary transmission mechanisms. Okay, the first is the interest rate channel, the second is the exchange rate channel, third is the balance sheet channel, and finally you have the asset price channel. So these are basically the four different mechanisms through which the monetary policy influences the price level and the national income. The first is the interest rate channel. So when the central bank increases the interest rate, okay, what happens is that the cost of borrowing will increase, and due to increase in the cost of borrowing, the households and the firms will borrow less, due to which the consumption expenditure will fall, the investment expenditure will fall, and ultimately this will reduce the aggregate demand. And when the aggregate demand, national income falls, the general price level will also come down. So this is known as the interest rate channel. The next is the exchange rate channel. So when the interest rate in the country increases, okay, the foreign exchange in the country will increase. Okay, the foreigners will like to park their reserves in India because the interest rate is higher. Now, because of increase in the supply of foreign exchange, what will happen is the domestic currency will appreciate. So there will be appreciation of the domestic currency, and when there is an appreciation of the domestic currency, the price of exports will increase, whereas the price of imports will decrease. So exports will become expensive, imports will become cheaper, due to which the aggregate demand in the economy will fall, which again will result into decrease in the prices. So this is known as the exchange rate channel, through which the monetary policy influences the aggregate demand and the prices. Now the next is the balance sheet channel. So whenever the interest rate increases, okay, the liabilities for the companies will increase, their gearing ratio, debt equity ratio will rise, and because of that it will be difficult for these companies to raise the finance, and since they are not able to raise the finance easily, the investment will fall. Now investment is one of the components of aggregate demand, so aggregate demand will also come down, reducing the prices. So this is known as the balance sheet channel. An increase in the interest rate increases the liability side for the companies, and due to that their debt equity ratio increases, which reduces their ability to raise the finance, and so the investment, aggregate demand, etc. will decrease. The next is the asset price channel. So when the interest rate increases, investment in the stock market becomes less attractive. Due to this, the demand for various stocks will fall, the prices of the stocks will fall, and since the prices of these assets, the stocks, will fall, the overall wealth of the households will fall, and because of reduced wealth, the households will reduce the consumption, which will reduce the aggregate demand and ultimately the prices. Next we have the instruments of monetary policy. The first instrument is the CRR. Now CRR is the minimum percentage of the deposit of the commercial banks which they must maintain as cash, okay, with the central bank, and increase in the CRR reduces the credit creation capacity of the commercial banks, and as a result the aggregate demand decreases. On the other hand, if there is a decrease in the CRR, then it increases the credit creation capacity of the commercial banks, due to which the aggregate demand will increase. The next is the statutory liquidity ratio. Now this ratio is a stipulated percentage of the bank's total deposits, okay, which it must hold in cash, gold, or in the form of securities with itself. The banks which fail to maintain this amount in prescribed manner, they will have to pay a penal interest rate to the central bank. Now increase in the SLR will reduce the credit creation capacity of the commercial bank, and thereby it will reduce the aggregate demand. On the other hand, if there is decrease in the SLR, it will increase the loan giving capacity of the commercial bank, which increases the aggregate demand. Next we have the liquidity adjustment facility, L. Now when the commercial banks need liquidity, they park their government securities with the central bank and they acquire the borrowings of equivalent amount. Now the commercial banks agree to buy back the securities at a decided future date, okay, at an agreed price. Okay. The future agreed price of the security is higher than its original price, and this difference in the interest rate charged by the central bank on the money lent to the commercial bank, that is known as the repo and reserve repo ratio. So this ratio is known as the repo rate. It is called the repo rate. And when the commercial banks have excess liquidity and they park it with the central bank by acquiring the government securities from the central bank, then the commercial banks agree to sell back the securities at a decided future date at an agreed price which is higher than the original. Now the difference is the interest paid by the central bank to the commercial bank, and this is known as the reverse repo rate. The previous one was repo rate, this one is known as the reverse repo rate. The entire process of taking and giving the securities back by the commercial banks, it is known as the liquidity adjustment facility. Now an increase in the repo rate will discourage the banks from borrowings, and this will reduce the credit creation capacity and aggregate demand will decrease. On the other hand, an increase in the reverse repo will encourage the banks to park more liquidity with the central bank, reducing the credit of the firms and households, and therefore the aggregate demand will fall. So both these rates will reduce the aggregate demand. Next is the marginal lending facility, rather marginal standing facility. This is the fourth one. Now here the central bank plays the role of the lender of the last resort. Every bank can borrow up to a limit through LAF, but if the bank suddenly needs more liquidity than available under the liquidity adjustment facility, then it can avail the MSF, that is marginal standing facility. Under the MSF, the commercial banks can draw on their SLR portfolio, right? That of course at an interest rate which is higher than that is paid under the LAF. And besides paying the LAF rate, okay, the banks pay a penalty for not being able to maintain the SLR. And then you have the market stabilization scheme. Now there is an MOU between the government and the central bank. If there is increase in the inflow of foreign exchange, then the government will buy it from central bank by issuing the securities, and thus the excess liquidity due to inflow of the foreign exchange is absorbed. So that is known as market stabilization scheme. And finally you have the open market operations. This includes open market purchase of government securities and open market sales. Next we are having a look at the first unit of the second chapter. The name of the chapter is Public Finance and the name of the unit is Fiscal Functions and Overview. Now there are three functions which the government has to perform, and the first is the allocation function. Now the allocation responsibility of the government involves The allocation responsibility of the government involves appropriate corrective action when the private markets fail to provide the right and desirable combination of goods and services. Now a variety of allocation instruments are available by which the government can influence the resource allocation in the economy. The second function which the government has to perform is called the redistribution function, and the redistribution function aims at redistributing the income so as to ensure equality and fairness to promote the well-being of all the sections of the people, and this is achieved through taxation, public expenditure, regulations and preferential treatment of the target population, right? The third important fiscal function is the stabilization function, and one of the key functions of the government's policy or the fiscal policy is to eliminate the macroeconomic fluctuations which are arising from suboptimal allocations. So concerned with the performance of the aggregate economy in terms of labor employment and capital utilization, overall output and income, general price level, economic growth and balance of international payment. So all these variables should remain stable, not just the prices, the employment of labor, capital utilization, overall output and income, general price level, economic growth and the balance of payment. What is the main challenge in the fiscal policy? So when the government is trying to achieve these objectives, the first major challenge is conflicting goals of the budgetary policy. So when the government tries to achieve one goal, the other goal gets sacrificed, and designing the budgetary policy in a way that the pursuit of one does not jeopardize the other is a big challenge. Now, let us describe why the government should perform the allocation function in an economy. The first reason that the government should perform the allocation function is imperfect competition and presence of monopoly power in different degrees, leading to underproduction and higher prices than would exist under the condition of perfect competition. So had there been perfect competition, the government's allocation role was not required. But since there is imperfect competition, we require government to intervene. Secondly, markets typically fail to provide collective goods which are by their very nature consumed in common by all the people. So had there been only private goods, the government's allocation function was not required. But since there are some public goods, you require the government to make the allocation of resources. The third is externalities, and these externalities arise when the production and consumption of good or service affects other people as well, for example, population. And finally, the allocation function of the government is required because of the imperfect information. These imperfect informations, they make market failure, they result into market failure, and they are the reason that the government should perform the allocative function. Okay. So because of lack of perfect information, there are some areas where the investment is less, and there are areas where the investment is more than required. Next, we try to understand how does the monopoly power affect the efficiency of the market. Imperfect competition and presence of monopoly power in different degrees lead to underproduction and higher prices than would exist under the conditions of perfect competition, something we saw earlier. This distorts the choices available to the customers and reduces the welfare. Next, how the government can get domestic producers to produce more pulses of any product. A variety of instruments are available by which the government can influence the resource allocation in the economy and get the domestic producers produce more of pulses. The government can influence the private allocation through incentives and disincentives. For example, the tax concessions and subsidies may be given for the production of goods that promote social welfare. So either tax concessions can be given to the producers. Okay. If at all there is tax on agricultural goods, then concession should be given. Subsidies can be given to encourage the production. Government can also provide free fertilizers, high yielding variety seeds and irrigation facilities to the farmers so that they produce more of pulses. And government can also declare a very high minimum support price for the pulses, so to encourage more farmers to produce pulses. Next, we try to enumerate the circumstances which necessitate the redistribution by the government. Now, the distribution responsibility of the government arises from the fact that left to the market, the distribution of income and wealth among individuals in the society is likely to be unequal or skewed, and therefore the government has to intervene to ensure more desirable and just distribution. The distributive function of the budget is related to the basic question: for whom should an economy produce goods and services? Next, we try to illustrate with an example the redistribution effect of tax and transfer policy. Tax and transfer means you impose tax on one and then collect the money and transfer it to the other. Now, taxation policies of the government whereby progressive taxation of the rich is combined with provision of subsidies to the poor households. Proceeds from the progressive taxes used for financing the public services, especially those that benefit the low-income households. For example, the supply of essential food grains at highly subsidized price to the below poverty line population. This will reduce the economic inequalities between the rich and poor. The next is, what is the objective of the government subsidy? The government provides subsidy aiming redistribution of income to achieve an equitable distribution of societal output among the households. it provides equality in income, wealth and opportunities. So that is the main objective behind providing a government subsidy. Government subsidy also provides security to the people who are having hardships. It ensures that everyone enjoys a minimal standard of living, and subsidies are also provided to encourage the consumption or production of selected products. Next, we try to understand why do private producers hesitate to produce the public parks, bridges and highways. Now, all the above public goods like bridges, parks, highways, okay, these goods, in case of these goods, it is impossible to exclude those who don't pay. So the problem of free rider will always exist, and private sector will not produce any product wherein it is impossible to charge a price. So that is the reason that the private sector does not produce these goods. There is a problem of free riding in these goods, in public goods, and that's why they are not produced. What reasons would you assign for employment reservations to socially backward community? Now, reservations to socially backward community is a part of government's redistributive function. Okay. The socially backward people are also economically backward due to their exploitation and marginalization they have suffered for many years, and reservation to them in employment is a way of compensating for the same. What would be the objective of the government when it declares special scheme for backward regions? Now, declaring special scheme for backward regions is also a part of redistributive function. Once again, it's a part of redistributive function of the government. Government declares such special schemes for backward regions to reduce regional disparities and ensure development of the backward regions. These schemes will encourage investment and employment in these backward regions. Number 10, what should be the public revenue and expenditure policy of the government during a recession? Now, during recession, the government increases the expenditure or cuts down the taxes or adopts a combination of both the policies so that aggregate demand is boosted with more money put into the hands of the people. In other words, the government should use expansionary fiscal policy to alleviate the recession or to remove the recession. And finally, we look at the rationale for stabilization function of the government policy. So why does government perform the stabilization function? Now, the theoretical rationale for the stabilization function of the government is derived from the Keynesian proposition that market economy does not automatically generate full employment and price stability, okay, and therefore the government should pursue the deliberate stabilization policies. If the economy was capable of full employment and stable prices, then stabilization function by the government would not have been required. But the fact that no economy automatically attains full employment, the government has to play the stabilization role. Now, business cycles are natural phenomenon in any economy and they tend to occur periodically. The market system has inherent tendencies to create the business cycles, and since there is fluctuation, you need someone to stabilize. So that's the reason that you require stabilization function from the government. So in the absence of appropriate corrective interventions by the government, the instabilities that occur in the economy in the form of recession, inflation, etc., they may be prolonged for longer periods, causing enormous hardships to the people, especially the poorest section of the society. So that's the reason that the government must perform the stabilization function. Now, next is the second unit from the second chapter. Name of this unit is market failure. Now, what do you mean by market failure? Market failure is a situation in which the free market fails to allocate the resources efficiently, in the sense that there is either overproduction or underproduction of particular goods or services, leading to less than optimum market outcomes. What do you mean by market power? Market power means excess market power causes the single producer or small number of producers to produce and sell less output than would be produced under competitive market. So whenever the producers start producing the output less than optimum output, that means they possess market power. Next is externalities. Now externalities are initiated and experienced not through the operation of the system but outside the market, and therefore they are external to the market. So externalities cause market inefficiencies because they hinder the ability of the market prices to convey accurately the information about how much to produce and how much to buy. Since externalities are not reflected in the market prices, they can be a source of economic inefficiency. Now these externalities are not part of the marketplace. They are also known as spillover effects, neighborhood effects, or third party or side effects. These are some of the examples of externalities. The first is negative production externality. When a factory which produces aluminium discharges untreated waste water into nearby river and pollutes the water, causing health hazards for the people who use the water for drinking and bathing. Pollution of the river also affects the fish output, as there will be less catch for fishermen due to the loss of fish resources. So first it was on the consumption and second it was on the production. Next you have positive production externalities. A firm which offers training to its employees for increasing their skills, the firm generates positive benefits on the firms when they hire such workers as they change their jobs. Another example is the case of a beekeeper who locates beehives in an orange growing area, enhancing the chances of greater production of oranges through increased pollination. Then you have negative consumption externalities. Smoking cigarettes in public place causes passive smoking by the others, creating litter and diminishing the aesthetic value of the room, and playing the radio loudly, obstructing one from enjoying a concert. Then you have an example of positive consumption externality. Now, consumption of the services of health club by the employees of a firm would result in an external benefit to the firm in the form of an increased efficiency and productivity. What do you mean by public goods? A public good, which is also called goods of collective consumption or social goods, okay, which all can enjoy in common, in the sense that each individual's consumption of such good leads to no subtraction from any other individual's consumption of that good. So basically these are the goods where you cannot exclude anyone from consuming even if they do not pay, and these are the goods where there is no rivalry. Increase in the consumption of consumption by more people will not reduce the consumption of the existing consumers. This is the classification of the public goods, in that you first have the pure public goods. And what are the characteristics of pure public goods? Consumption is collective in nature, means you don't consume these goods individually, these goods are collectively consumed. For example, a road or a street light or defense services. Then public goods are indivisible. There is a characteristic of non-excludability. You cannot exclude anyone from consumption. There is non-rivalry in consumption, and finally you cannot claim private property rights on these goods. So public goods can be classified as quasi-public goods. The quasi-public goods or services, also called the near public goods, for example education, health services, they possess nearly all the qualities of a private good, and some of the benefits of public goods, they exhibit market failure because of the incomplete markets. So product as such is a private good, but the externalities which it generates has the qualities of the public good. Then you have private goods. Private goods are rivalrous in nature. That means when one person increases the consumption of the other one will reduce. And then there is possibility of exclusion. So excludability is also characteristic of private goods, and they are less likely to have free rider problem. Additional resources costs are involved for providing another people. So if you want to provide a private good to more people, additional cost will have to be incurred, something which is not the case with the public goods. This is how the public goods can be classified. Okay, all goods can be classified. If the product has the characteristic of rivalry and exclusion, they are known as private goods, like food, clothing, car, etc. If the product is having the characteristic of non-exclusion and non-rivalry, they are called pure public goods, such as national defense. If the product is having the characteristic of rivalry, but at the same time there is non-exclusion, they are called common resources, such as the fish stock, forest resources, coal, etc. And if the products have the characteristics of exclusion but there is no rivalry, then they are known as club goods, like cinemas, private parks, satellite television, etc. And finally, the meaning of asymmetric information. Asymmetric information occurs when there is an imbalance between the information which is there with the buyer and the seller. That is when the buyer knows more than the seller, or vice versa. Now this distorts the choices. With asymmetric information, low quality goods, that is lemons, can drive high quality goods, that is plums, out of the market. And asymmetric information, adverse selection and moral hazard, they affect the ability of the markets to efficiently allocate the resources.
If you like this video, share it with your friends. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch more such videos and learn from our expert faculty members. Press the bell icon to get regular notifications whenever we upload a new video. Download NDI mobile app to get complete CA course online. We value your support. Thank you for watching.